Okay, you probably don't know this, but this is my third try at recording this video, and we're going to be talking about ellipses today. And so when we talk about ellipses, you'll notice on our first page in our notes here, we have all this great information, and I want to tell you that you can take a look at that later. I'm going to teach all this stuff in the context of our problems, and what you'll notice is there are two kind of general ideas. One happens if you are stretching in the x direction and one in the y direction. Probably the most important thing that I want you to remember off of these slides for right now is that whatever you're talking about, a squared is always the largest number. So if you look under the parentheses when we start doing these, whatever is the biggest number under the parentheses, that's our a value. Let's try and learn some of this in the context of a problem. So whenever you're doing any of these ellipses, the most important thing to remember is that everything is based off of your center. And your center is represented by the letters H and K. Or in other words, the things that make your parentheses 0. The H is the thing that makes your x parentheses 0, and the K is the thing that makes your y parentheses 0. When we do these, it's very helpful to put things in what we call standard form. So I'm going to rewrite the equation that you see right here in its standard form, even though it might be a little bit ridiculous. And what I mean by that is that I'm going to write it as x minus 0 squared plus y minus 0 squared over 9 and 4, and it's equal to 1. Now the 9 and the 4, of course, are numbers being squared. The 9 is a squared, and the 4 is b squared. And all of these pieces of information are going to help me graph my ellipse. The first thing, since it's the most important thing, is always to talk about your center. So the center in this case is 0, 0, because those are the numbers that make my x and y parentheses 0. If I go to graph this ellipse, what I know is I need to put on my center first, because everything is based off the center. So my center is at 0, 0. Now as I look underneath my x and y parentheses, I notice that the bigger number is the 9, which happens to be under the x parentheses. So that means if I take the square root of 9, which is 3, from my center I will go in the x direction. Sorry about that. I will go in the x direction 3 units. So for my vertices, I go 3 units to the right and 3 units to the left, because the 9 is the a squared value, so that means a has to be 3, or in other words, I went 3 left and right from my center. If I write down those coordinates, that means I have 3, 0, and I have negative 3, 0 for my vertices. I can also find my co-vertices, because the co-vertices is the shorter distance, or the distance along the minor axis, the shorter axis that is. And underneath the y parentheses, I see a 4. If I take the square root of 4, I get 2, which means from my center, I'm going to go up and down 2 units. If I write the coordinates of those points, I will get 0, 2, and 0, negative 2. These are the coordinates of my co-vertices. And so underneath the x happened to be the a squared, underneath the y happened to be the b squared. That means that my a was 3 and my b was 2. I can now graph my ellipse. Here's the graph of my ellipse. There is one other thing that they ask us to find. And in this, last thing that I have to find are my foci. From our notes, you will find that our foci have a very special formula. My foci formula is c squared equals a squared minus b squared. And the a squared will always be the bigger number, the b squared will always be the smaller number. So in this case, that means c squared equals 9 minus 4, because the a was 3 being squared, which is 9. The b was 2 being squared is 4. That means my c squared equals 5, or in other words, c equals plus or minus the square root of 5. What this is telling me is that from my center, I will go with the square root of 5 along the major axis And since I know that I was stretched more in the x direction, that was my major axis, so I'm going to go with the square root of 5 units horizontally from my center. Now I don't know the exact value of the square root of 5, but I know it's a little bit more than 2 since the square root of 4 is 2. So if I go a little bit more than 2 in the x direction from my center, I'm about here. And if I go to the left, I'm about here. And if I were to write the coordinates of my foci, from my center, I'm going to go to the left, the square root of 5, which is negative radical 5, but I'm not going to go up or down. And I'm also going to go to the right, the square root of 5 from my center, which is in the x direction, and not go up or down. So the foci are found using c squared equals a squared minus b squared. Once you get that value, which in this case is the square root of 5, you go either up and down, left and right, depending on which direction is your major axis. The foci are always located in the longer direction. It might be a little helpful to look at a more complicated one or one that's already in its standard form. So as I look at this thing in its standard form, again, remembering that everything is based off the center, I'm going to write down the center to begin with. In this case, my center is at 2, 1. So now as I look at graphing this thing, and I put a coordinate axis down, knowing that my center is at 2, 1, I place my center on the graph at 2, 1, and then everything will be based off of that center, of course. So as I extend out here, I notice that the bigger number is under the y. And as I look at the bigger number under the y, I see that it's 25. That means in order to find my vertices, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go the square root of 25 up and down from my center. Or in other words, 5 units up from my center and 5 units down from my center to find my vertices. That means that my vertices are going to be at 2, 6 and 2, negative 4. After I find my vertices, I can also find my covertices. In order to find my covertices, I look at my smaller number underneath my parentheses, which is a 9. I take the square root of that number, which means that's 3. And the square root of 9 is 3, so that means I'm going to go left and right 3 units from my center. And I can write down those coordinates. So one of those coordinates is going to be at negative 1, 1. And my other coordinate is going to be 3 units to the right of my center, which is going to be at 5, 1. At this point, I can draw my ellipse. It looks something like the following. I notice that this ellipse is stretched in the y direction more, which means that when I go to find my foci will be in the vertical direction. So as I find my foci, I know that that formula is c squared equals a squared minus b squared. Or in other words, c squared equals 25 minus 9. So c squared equals 16, which means that my c is plus or minus 4. This tells me that I'm going to go 4 units up and down from my center because my up and down direction is the greater stretch, or in other words, the major axis. So if I go 4 units up, I'm here, and if I go 4 units down, I'm here. I can write down the coordinates of these foci. So 4 units up from my center would be at 2, 6, no, sorry, it's 2, 5. And 4 units down from my center would be at 2, negative 3. In number 3, you'll notice that we don't have anything in its standard form. In fact, because it's all stretched out like this, we're going to have to do completing the square twice. So when you're completing the square,